The combat pilots at Stormwind Air Force Base burst into laughter when Staff Sergeant Rebecca Santana volunteered to fly the suicide mission into Shadow Valley that had already killed 3 experienced aviators. "She's just a mechanic," they scoffed, dismissing the quiet woman who spent her days elbow-deep in aircraft engines. But 4 hours later, when she emerged from the smoking wreckage of an F-35 Lightning II after pulling off the most impossible rescue in modern military history, those same pilots would be standing in stunned silence, realizing they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Santana arrived at Stormwind Air Force Base every morning at 4:23 a.m., exactly 17 minutes before her shift officially began. At 29, she possessed the steady hands of someone who had spent the last 8 years maintaining some of the most sophisticated aircraft ever built. Her shoulder-length black hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun that never seemed to come loose, no matter how many grueling hours she worked under the desert sun. The other mechanics had nicknamed her the Phantom because she moved through the massive hangars with such silent efficiency that you'd barely notice her presence until you realized your F-35 was running better than it had since leaving the factory. Rebecca clutched her weathered tactical notebook against her chest as she walked through the pre-dawn darkness of the Nevada desert. Its pages were filled with meticulous maintenance logs, system diagnostics, and something the others didn't know about: detailed flight procedures she had copied by hand during every spare moment of the past 5 years. The security guards at the main gate had long since stopped checking her credentials. Rebecca Santana was as much a permanent fixture at Stormwind as the reinforced concrete runways themselves, but Rebecca carried a burden that gnawed at her every single day. 8 years ago, she had been a rising star in the Navy's elite aviation program, the kind of sailor that instructors pointed to as the gold standard of excellence. She had mastered every technical subject, absorbed aircraft systems like a human computer, and dreamed of nothing but soaring through the skies in a naval fighter jet. Her test scores were mathematically perfect, her understanding of aerodynamics was profound, and her dedication was absolutely unquestionable. Then came the psychological evaluation that shattered her world. The panel of stone-faced officers had sat across from her in that sterile evaluation room, clipboards in hand, and delivered the verdict that would haunt her for years: not temperamentally suited for combat aviation. They wanted aggression, they explained. They wanted someone who could make instant life-or-death decisions to engage enemy targets without hesitation. Rebecca's methodical approach, her preference for calculated precision over raw aggression, her tendency to think 3 steps ahead rather than react instinctively, all of it was deemed incompatible with the demands of naval aviation. The rejection still echoed in her mind every morning as she walked past the F-35C Lightning A's in their climate-controlled hangars. These cutting-edge stealth fighters represented everything she had been denied. She knew their systems better than the pilots who actually flew them, could diagnose their most complex malfunctions in her sleep, and had memorized every specification in their 1,000-page technical manuals. But she was never allowed to touch the flight controls, never permitted to feel the awesome power of their engines responding to her commands. Instead, she had been reassigned to maintenance, a role that felt like being handed a participation trophy when you had trained your entire life for Olympic gold. After her Navy discharge, the Air Force had welcomed her technical expertise, but the pain of unfulfilled dreams remained. Day after day, she calibrated flight computers, replaced sensor arrays, and updated software on aircraft she would never be permitted to pilot. The closest she ever came to the cockpit was during pre-flight inspections, ensuring every system was perfect for someone else's mission. What nobody at Stormwind knew was that Rebecca had found her own way to fly. Every morning, 2.5 hours before her official shift began, she slipped into the abandoned Flight Simulation Center in Building D. The facility was scheduled for demolition next year to make room for expanded maintenance bays. But until then, its outdated but fully functional simulators hummed quietly in the darkness. In the ethereal blue glow of those aging monitors, Rebecca had logged over 4,100 hours of virtual flight time, more than most active combat pilots would accumulate in their entire careers. She flew the same routes that real pilots flew, practiced emergency procedures they would hopefully never encounter, and mastered maneuvers that existed only in the most advanced training programs. Each simulated hour was a quiet act of rebellion against the system that had labeled her unfit for the cockpit. It was a private dedication to a dream she absolutely refused to abandon, no matter how many years passed or how many people told her to accept her limitations. The simulator didn't care about her psychological evaluation or her supposed lack of killer instinct. It only cared about skill, precision, and the ability to bring an aircraft home safely through impossible circumstances. And in that virtual world, Rebecca Santana was unstoppable. This particular morning, as Rebecca powered up the simulation system with practiced efficiency, she noticed something different on the mission selection board. A new scenario had been added overnight: Shadow Valley Deep Strike. The name sent an involuntary chill down her spine. Shadow Valley was legendary among military aviators, and not in a good way. It was a geological nightmare located deep in hostile territory, a place where electromagnetic anomalies created dead zones that rendered radar and communications completely useless. It was the kind of place where experienced combat pilots went to disappear forever, where the landscape itself seemed designed to swallow aircraft whole. Rebecca selected the mission and settled into the familiar pilot's seat as the simulation loaded. She whispered a prayer her uncle had taught her before he died testing experimental aircraft 15 years ago. Fly smart, fly precise, and always find your way home. She didn't know it yet, but in just a few hours those words would become more than a family tradition. They would become her lifeline. The simulation began, and Rebecca Santana disappeared into the digital sky, completely unaware that this would be her final practice run before facing the real thing. The emergency klaxon that would change her life forever was still 3 hours away, but destiny was already setting the stage for the most impossible rescue mission in modern military history. The emergency alarm that shattered the pre-dawn stillness of Stormwind Air Force Base sounded like the voice of doom itself. Rebecca's hands froze on the simulator controls as crimson warning lights began strobing throughout Building D, casting everything in an apocalyptic glow. She had heard that sound only once before in her 3 years at the base, and it had meant one thing: American lives were hanging in the balance. She quickly shut down the simulation and sprinted toward the main operations center, her tactical notebook pressed tightly against her chest. The entire base was erupting into controlled chaos. Mechanics were running between aircraft with the urgency of people who understood that every second could mean the difference between life and death. Ground crews were fueling jets at record speed, and officers were shouting orders over the wailing alarm that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Rebecca had witnessed this deadly serious choreography before, but never with such desperate intensity. In the primary command center, she pressed herself against the wall and caught fragments of urgent conversations that made her blood run cold. A 12-person Special Operations Squadron led by Major Jennifer Storm Anderson had been conducting a deep reconnaissance mission in enemy territory when everything had gone catastrophically wrong. Communication severed at 0347 hours, reported a communications specialist, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Last known position was grid reference 77 Alpha, approximately 15 clicks into hostile territory. Intelligence. indicates they're surrounded by enemy forces who have them pinned down in a location that makes conventional rescue virtually impossible. The tactical display screen showed a three-dimensional map of the operational area, and Rebecca felt her stomach drop when she saw the terrain. The squadron was trapped in a narrow canyon system deep within Shadow Valley, the exact same geological nightmare she had just been practicing in simulation. The irony was so stark it felt like the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke. "They need immediate supply drop," continued the briefing officer, his words coming in rapid-fire bursts. "Medical equipment, ammunition, communication gear, and emergency rations. Without resupply, they'll be overrun within 6 hours. The enemy has them completely surrounded, and conventional ground extraction is impossible due to the terrain and hostile presence." Captain Tyler Ace Morrison, Stormwind's most experienced F-35 pilot, stood at the center of the briefing room. His normally confident demeanor was replaced by something Rebecca had never seen before: genuine fear. Around him, other combat pilots studied the mission parameters on the holographic display, and she watched their faces grow pale as they absorbed the details. The words "Shadow Valley" appeared on the screen in bold red letters, and Rebecca observed several pilots actually take involuntary steps backward. She understood their reaction completely. Shadow Valley wasn't just dangerous, it was legendary for all the wrong reasons. In the past 5 years, 7 different rescue attempts had been made in similar electromagnetic dead zones. None of the aircraft had returned home. "It's a death sentence," muttered Lieutenant Jake Razor Brooks, a hotshot pilot who usually volunteered for the most dangerous missions without hesitation. "The electromagnetic interference will kill every electronic system we have. We'll be flying completely blind through the most hostile airspace in the entire region, with no radar. No GPS, no communications, nothing. Thermal-seeking missiles blanket that entire canyon system," added another pilot, his voice hollow with the weight of previous losses. "Even if we could somehow navigate through the interference, we'd never make it out alive. The terrain funnels aircraft into kill zones that have been precisely pre-targeted by enemy artillery." Rebecca found herself studying the tactical display with the intense focus that had made her legendary among maintenance crews. She knew Shadow Valley better than anyone in that room, having flown it 247 times in simulation. She had mapped every wind current, every thermal pocket, every hidden ravine that could provide cover from surface-to-air missiles. She knew the 3 possible approach vectors that might allow an aircraft to get in and out with minimal exposure to enemy fire, but she was just a mechanic, invisible to the decision-makers who would ultimately choose which pilot to send on this suicide mission. She pressed herself further against the wall, trying to remain unnoticed while absorbing every critical detail of the briefing. That's when Stormwind's advanced AI tactical system chimed with its mission assignment. Protocol. Rebecca watched the massive screen as the computer began analyzing pilot qualifications, flight hours, technical expertise, and mission-specific requirements. The algorithm was brutally efficient and completely objective. It didn't care about rank, reputation, or military politics. It only cared about raw data and the mathematical probability of mission success. The room fell into absolute silence as the eye processed thousands of variables in seconds. Personnel files, training records, simulator hours, technical knowledge assessments, and psychological profiles all fed into the calculation. Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as the system reached its conclusion. Collective gasp rippled through the command center like a shockwave when a name appeared on the screen in bold blue letters: Staff Sergeant Rebecca Santana, primary candidate for Shadow Valley mission. Captain Morrison's face went from pale to bright red with indignation. "Her," he scoffed, pointing directly at Rebecca as if she were some kind of malfunctioning piece of equipment. "She's barely qualified to change engine oil, let alone pilot an F-35 through a combat zone. The computer has obviously suffered a critical malfunction. The room erupted in nervous laughter that felt more like hysteria than humor. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she remained perfectly still, her expression carefully neutral. She had learned years ago that defending herself only made the mockery worse. Instead, she simply clutched her notebook tighter and waited for the storm of ridicule to pass over her. But in that moment of collective dismissal, Rebecca Santana made a decision that would change everything. Instead of shrinking away or accepting their judgment, she stepped forward from the shadows and cleared her throat. Every head in the room turned toward her, and for the first time in her military career, she had everyone's complete and undivided attention. The silence in the command center stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Rebecca Santana stood motionless in the harsh fluorescent lighting, her tactical notebook clutched against her chest while dozens of pairs of eyes scrutinized her with mixtures of disbelief, curiosity, and barely concealed contempt. She felt more exposed than if she had been standing there completely naked. But something deep inside her had fundamentally shifted. The years of quiet acceptance were over. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart, "I request permission to speak." General Marcus Titan Reynolds, the base commander, hadn't spoken since the AI's shocking recommendation. He was a 62-year-old combat veteran who had survived more aerial engagements than most pilots would ever see, and he had built a legendary reputation for making decisions based on cold, hard facts rather than popular opinion or military politics. He studied Rebecca with calculating gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Permission granted, Sergeant," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a precision blade. "Explain to me why my computer thinks a maintenance technician should pilot a $30 million aircraft into the most dangerous airspace in the world." Rebecca opened her notebook with hands that were steadier than she had any right to expect. The pages were filled with hand-drawn maps, wind calculations, approach vectors, and detailed mission notes that represented thousands of hours of obsessive preparation. "I've flown Shadow Valley 247 times, sir," she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I know every wind pattern, every thermal updraft, every electromagnetic dead zone, and every pocket where the interference is weakest enough to allow brief communication windows." She placed the notebook on the briefing table, and the assembled officers leaned forward despite themselves. The pages were covered with meticulous technical drawings that looked like they belonged in an advanced flight manual. "I know where the anti-aircraft batteries are positioned based on maintenance reports from damaged aircraft. I know the 3 possible approach routes that might allow someone to penetrate the valley and extract alive. And I know the emergency procedures for every system failure scenario that could occur in an F-35 operating under those conditions." Captain Morrison scoffed loudly, his voice dripping with disdain. "And exactly how would a mechanic acquire classified intelligence about enemy positions and electromagnetic interference patterns?" Rebecca met his gaze without flinching. "Because I listen, sir. When pilots return from reconnaissance missions, they debrief. When maintenance crews repair battle damage, they document what they've observed. When communications specialists analyze interference patterns, they share their findings with the technical staff who need to understand system vulnerabilities. I've been piecing together the real tactical picture of Shadow Valley for the past 4 years. Listening to hangar gossip doesn't qualify you to fly a combat mission," Morrison shot back, his voice rising with each word. "You want to know what makes a combat pilot? It's the ability to make split-second life or death decisions when people are actively trying to kill you. It's the mental toughness to pull 8 Gs while dodging surface-to-air missiles. It's the real-world experience of actual aerial combat, not playing video games in a simulator." The personal attack hit Rebecca like a physical blow. but she had endured far worse humiliation throughout her military career. "You're absolutely right, sir," she replied quietly. "I don't have combat experience. I don't have the psychological profile of a typical fighter pilot. But I have something else that might be more valuable in this specific situation. I have preparation. I have technical knowledge that goes beyond flying. And right now, I might be the only person in this room who has even a remote chance of bringing Major Anderson and her team home alive." Lieutenant Commander Drake Viper Chun, Morrison's wingman, shook his head in apparent disbelief. "This is completely insane. We're actually considering sending a maintenance technician on what amounts to a suicide mission. She'd be shot down before she reached the target zone." "Then what exactly do you suggest?" General Reynolds asked, his voice sharp enough to cut steel. "Every qualified combat pilot in this room has examined this mission and declared it impossible. We have 12 special operations personnel who will be overrun and killed within hours if they don't receive those supplies. The AI system has identified Sergeant Santana as our statistically best option based on pure data analysis. What alternative course of action do you propose?" The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Rebecca watched as the pilots exchanged uncomfortable glances, each waiting for someone else to volunteer for the mission they had all dismissed as impossible. But no one stepped forward. No one raised their hand. The mission was too dangerous. The odds too remote. The probability of survival too close to zero. That's when Captain Morrison delivered the blow. That would echo in Rebecca's memory for the rest of her life. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with contempt and resignation. "Send the mechanic. When she crashes and burns in Shadow Valley, at least we'll know we exhausted every option. But I want it on record that I warned against this decision. When that F-35 becomes a smoking crater, remember that we could have waited for reinforcements or developed a different strategy, instead of throwing away critical military assets on a desperate gamble." Rebecca felt something break inside her chest, not her heart, which she had armored against such cruelty years ago, but something deeper. A barrier that had been holding her back from fully embracing this moment. Morrison's casual assumption of her failure, his dismissive tone, the complete lack of faith in her years of preparation, it all crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard determination. She closed her notebook with a sharp snap that echoed through the command center like a gunshot. When she looked up, her eyes held a new intensity that made several officers involuntarily step backward. "I'll take the mission," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a laser. "But I want 3 things on record. First, when I bring Major Anderson and her team home safely, I want a formal acknowledgement from every person in this room who laughed at my qualifications. Second, I want Captain Morrison to personally sign off on my mission briefing, so when I succeed, everyone knows exactly who doubted me. And third, I want my technical modifications to the F-35 implemented immediately, because I'm not just going to fly this mission, I'm going to revolutionize how it's flown." The audacity of her demands sent a ripple of shock through the room, but General Reynolds was already nodding slowly. Rebecca Santana had just transformed from invisible mechanic to the center of the most critical mission Stormwind had ever attempted. General Reynolds studied Rebecca for what felt like an eternity, his weathered face revealing nothing of his internal calculations. The command center had fallen so silent that the hum of air conditioning seemed as loud as jet engines. "Finally," he spoke with the measured authority of someone who had made life or death decisions for 3 decades. "Staff Sergeant Santana," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "you are hereby authorized to pilot F-35B Lightning Strike 312 on this mission. This is a direct order from the base commander. Captain Morrison, you will provide full mission support, including comprehensive briefing and pre-flight authorization. Sergeant Walsh, prepare the aircraft for immediate departure." Captain Morrison's face cycled through several shades of red. before settling on a pale complexion that suggested he was reconsidering every assumption he had ever made. "Sir, with all due respect, are we really going to?" "The decision is made, Captain," Reynolds interrupted sharply. "Sergeant Santana will fly this mission because she's the only person in this room who is actually prepared for it. Now execute your orders." Rebecca felt a surge of vindication mixed with absolute terror. In less than 2 hours, she would be strapped into the cockpit of one of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built, flying toward airspace that had killed every pilot who had attempted to penetrate it. But for the first time in her military career, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. As the briefing room began to empty, Technical Sergeant Diana Hammer Walsh approached Rebecca with a metal equipment case in her weathered hands. Diana was a 20-year veteran crew chief who had supervised more combat missions than most pilots would ever fly, and she had been quietly watching Rebecca's methodical approach to aircraft maintenance for years. "I heard what happened in there," Diana said quietly, setting the case down and opening it to reveal a collection of specialized equipment. "I also heard what you said to Morrison. Word travels fast around here, faster than you might think." Rebecca continued reviewing her mission notes, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. "Morrison's right about one thing. I don't have real combat experience. I've never been shot at, never had to make instant decisions while people were actively trying to kill me. But you've made life or death decisions every single day," Diana replied firmly. "Every time you've certified an aircraft as mission ready, you've been holding pilots' lives in your hands. Every maintenance check, every system repair, every safety inspection, you've been making decisions that determine whether someone comes home alive. The only difference now is that you'll be holding your own life in those same capable hands." Diana pulled a small device from the case that looked like it had survived several wars. "This belonged to my husband before he died in Afghanistan. It's a backup navigation unit that works independently of all electronic systems. He swore it saved his life more times than he could count when GPS and radar failed in hostile territory." Rebecca accepted the device with the reverence it deserved. "Diana, I can't take this. It's too important to you." "Yes, you can, and you will," Diana said firmly. "Because in about 90 minutes, you're going to climb into that cockpit and do something that no one else on this base has the courage or skill to attempt. You're going to save 12 lives, and you're going to come home. And when you do, everyone who doubted you is going to have to live with the fact that they were completely wrong." As Diana walked away, Rebecca continued her pre-mission preparation with renewed focus. She reviewed every system specification, tested every backup procedure, and mentally rehearsed every emergency protocol. This wasn't just mission planning, it was a ritual that calmed her nerves and centered her mind on the task ahead. That's when she noticed someone watching her from the shadows between the equipment racks. Senior Airman Casey Sparks Patel stepped forward hesitantly. Casey was perhaps 21 years old, a recent graduate from technical school who had been assigned to Rebecca's maintenance crew just 4 months ago. "Sergeant Santana," Casey said, voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to thank you before you go." Rebecca looked up from her mission planning materials. "Thank me for what?" "For showing me how to do this job right. For never losing patience when I made mistakes. For teaching me that being thorough isn't the same as being slow, and that attention to detail can literally save lives." Casey shifted nervously, then reached into a cargo pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "I wrote down the frequencies for 3 different emergency communication channels that most pilots don't know about. My father was a communications specialist in Iraq, and he taught me about backup systems that can sometimes work even when primary communications fail." Rebecca looked at the carefully written numbers, then at the young airman who had thought to provide them. "Casey, this could actually save my life, thank you." As she tucked the paper into her flight suit pocket, Rebecca realized that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. In the vast machinery of the military, among all the officers who had dismissed her and pilots who had mocked her, there were people who had been quietly watching, quietly supporting, quietly believing in her capabilities. She made her way to Hangar 7, where F-35B Lightning Strike 312 waited under the brilliant work lights. This particular aircraft had been her responsibility for 18 months. She knew every rivet, every wire, every system quirk that made this specific fighter unique. While other mechanics saw generic military hardware, Rebecca saw individuals with distinct personalities and characteristics. Lightning Strike 312 had always been special. It responded better to gentle handling than aggressive inputs. Its left engine ran slightly cooler than specifications suggested, and its navigation system had a minor calibration variance that she had learned to compensate for during routine maintenance. Most importantly, this aircraft had never experienced a maintenance-related malfunction under her care. Perfect record that was about to be put to the ultimate test. As Rebecca began her final pre-flight inspection, she whispered the prayer her uncle had taught her: fly smart, fly precise, and always find your way home. In 30 minutes, she would discover whether years of obsessive preparation could overcome a lifetime of being underestimated. The F-35B Lightning II lifted off from Stormwind Air Force Base at 0831 hours, its single Pratt & Whitney engine producing 40,000 pounds of thrust that pressed Rebecca back into the pilot's seat with familiar yet thrilling force. But this time was different from all those thousands of simulator hours. This time, real lives hung in the balance, and the margin for error was exactly 0. As the aircraft climbed through the crystal-clear Nevada morning sky, Rebecca felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. All the doubt, all the mockery, all the years of being dismissed, none of it mattered now. What mattered was the mission, the 12 Special Operations personnel trapped in Shadow Valley, and her ability to bring them the supplies they desperately needed to survive. Lightning Strike 312, you are cleared for mission approach vector, came the voice of Captain Morrison through her headset. Despite his earlier contempt, his tone was now strictly professional. Current weather conditions are optimal, with clear skies and minimal wind interference. Godspeed, Sergeant. Rebecca noticed the pause before his final words, the subtle shift in his voice that suggested even Morrison was beginning to grasp the magnitude of what she was attempting. Copy that, Control. Lightning Strike 312 proceeding to target zone. Estimated time to Shadow Valley perimeter, 47 minutes. For the next 38 minutes, Rebecca flew through perfect flying conditions, using the time to fine-tune her approach and run through emergency procedures one final time. She tested every backup system, verified every alternative protocol, and mentally rehearsed the route she had flown countless times in simulation. The familiar weight of her uncle's photograph in her chest pocket gave her a tangible connection to the legacy of courage she was carrying forward. Deanna Walsh's navigation device sat securely mounted on her instrument panel, its simple display showing her position with reassuring accuracy. Casey Patel's emergency frequency list was clipped to her kneeboard, ready for instant access if her primary communications failed. Every piece of equipment, every backup plan, every detail had been considered and prepared for Dot as she approached the outer perimeter of Shadow Valley. The first ominous signs began to appear. Her primary GPS navigation system started showing irregular readings, the coordinates flickering between accurate positions and complete nonsense. The electromagnetic interference that made this region so deadly was beginning to affect her aircrafts. Sophisticated electronic systems, just as she had expected. Lightning Strike 312, we're beginning to lose your radar signature, came the voice from Stormwind Control, now faint and distorted with static. Repeat, we're losing your signal on primary tracking. Copy that, Control. Beginning manual navigation. Procedures now, Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the growing interference. She switched off her electronic navigation systems and activated Diana's mechanical backup unit, which continued to show her position with rock-solid stability despite the electronic chaos erupting around her. The landscape below began to transform as she entered Shadow Valley proper. What had been gentle desert hills and scrubland gave way to a nightmare of twisted rock formations, deep canyons and shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun's position. Rebecca understood immediately why this place had earned such a deadly reputation among aviators. It looked like the surface of an alien planet, hostile and forbidding. Her sophisticated instruments began failing in rapid sequence, exactly as she had anticipated. First, the advanced radar display went completely dark. Then the autopilot disengaged with a warning tone that echoed through the cockpit. Finally, her primary communications array dissolved into crackling static, leaving her effectively blind and mute as she penetrated deeper into the most dangerous airspace in the region. Rebecca had trained extensively for this exact scenario. While other pilots relied heavily on electronic systems, she had spent years developing the fundamental skills that her uncle's generation had mastered: visual navigation, manual flight control, and the ability to read atmospheric conditions. Like an ancient mariner reading the stars, she dropped her altitude to 800 feet above the canyon floor and began navigating by landmarks she had memorized from hundreds of reconnaissance photographs. A distinctive rock spire marked the 5-mile checkpoint. A peculiar mesa formation indicated she was halfway to the target zone. A narrow gorge with specific erosion patterns meant she was approaching the most dangerous section of the flight. That's when the anti-aircraft fire began. The first burst of explosive flak appeared off her port wing, a deadly flower of shrapnel and fire that illuminated the canyon walls with hellish light. Rebecca banked hard right, feeling the G-forces press against her body as she dove toward a narrow ravine she'd had identified during her simulation training. The F-35 responded to her commands with precision, its advanced flight systems working in perfect harmony with her manual inputs. More explosions erupted around her as hidden gun positions revealed themselves, their muzzle flashes creating a deadly constellation against the canyon walls. Rebecca realized that enemy forces had significantly upgraded their defenses since the last intelligence reports. There were at least twice as many anti-aircraft batteries as expected, positioned in locations that created overlapping fields of fire designed to trap any aircraft foolish enough to enter the valley. She pulled Lightning Strike 312 into a climbing spiral, using a technique she had developed during her simulation training. An unpredictable flight pattern that confused automated targeting systems while maintaining forward momentum toward her objective. The maneuver was so unconventional that it bought her precious seconds to identify the Special Operations Team's position. Through the chaos of gunfire and explosions, Rebecca spotted a series of infrared signals rising from a concealed position near the base of a sheer cliff. That had to be Major Anderson's team. Exactly where intelligence had predicted they would establish their defensive perimeter, but reaching them would require flying through the densest concentration of anti-aircraft fire she had ever encountered, even in her most challenging simulations. Rebecca took a deep breath, whispered her uncle's prayer one more time, and pushed Lightning Strike 312 into a steep attack dive, racing toward the trapped soldiers at nearly 500 miles per hour. The aircraft shuddered as shrapnel from nearby explosions peppered its armored hull, and warning lights began flashing across her instrument panel as secondary systems started failing under the assault. But Rebecca held her course, her hands steady on the controls as she guided the F-35 through the gauntlet of enemy fire that was determined to bring her down. At 400 feet above the canyon floor, Rebecca opened the cargo bay doors of Lightning Strike 312 and released the supply drop with surgical precision. Medical equipment, ammunition, communications gear, and emergency rations fell toward Major Anderson's position in carefully calculated packages, each one designed to deploy at exactly the right altitude to ensure safe delivery despite the chaotic conditions. Rebecca watched in her mirrors as the supplies landed precisely where they needed to be, a perfect delivery that would give the trapped Special Operations Team a fighting chance against overwhelming odds. But as she pulled out of the dive and began her escape climb, a searing flash of white-hot light erupted from her starboard wing. A direct hit from a concealed anti-aircraft gun had torn through the F-35's right wing, severing critical hydraulic lines and destroying the primary flight control computer. Alarms screamed throughout the cockpit as the aircraft immediately began losing stability, its sophisticated fly-by-wire systems fighting a losing battle against massive structural damage. Rebecca's years of preparation kicked in instantly. She switched to manual flight controls, using pure muscle memory and instinctive understanding of aerodynamics to wrestle the wounded aircraft back into stable flight. Lightning Strike 312 responded grudgingly, its damaged systems fighting against her every command as she struggled to maintain altitude and heading. She was 57 miles from home, flying a crippled aircraft through hostile territory with most of her instruments dark and her communications completely severed. Any reasonable pilot would have considered ejecting immediately, but Rebecca Santana had not come this far to abandon the mission or the aircraft that had gotten her this far. The right wing was hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid and trailing thick black smoke that would make her visible to enemy forces for miles. Her primary flight computer was completely offline, leaving her with nothing but mechanical linkages and her own determination to bridge the gap between Shadow Valley and safety. Without functioning electronic instruments, Rebecca navigated by landmarks she had obsessively memorized during her years of preparation. A distinctive radio tower marked the 15-mile checkpoint. A highway interchange crossing the dry riverbed indicated 30 miles from base. A small town with a peculiar water tower meant she was 20 miles out and still miraculously alive. Damaged wing was creating massive aerodynamic drag, forcing Rebecca to maintain constant pressure on the manual controls to prevent the aircraft from rolling into an unrecoverable spin. Her shoulders ached from the strain, and sweat stung her eyes despite the cold air whistling through holes torn in the cockpit canopy by flying shrapnel. At the 12-mile marker, Lightning Strike 312's engine began showing signs of critical distress. The temperature gauge climbed steadily into the red zone, and Rebecca could hear the subtle but ominous change in the engine's note that indicated imminent failure. She had perhaps 8 minutes of flight time remaining before the power plant would seize completely, turning her F-35 into a very expensive glider. That's when she remembered Casey Patel's emergency communication frequencies. She switched to the backup radio system and transmitted on the underground channel the young airman had carefully written down for her. Any station. This is Lightning Strike 312 requesting immediate emergency assistance. I am 12 miles southwest of Stormwind, aircraft critically damaged. Requesting immediate runway clearance for emergency landing. Static filled her headset for several heart-stopping seconds. Then a familiar voice responded with unmistakable relief and urgency. Lightning Strike 312, this is Stormwind emergency. Rebecca, thank God you're alive. We've been trying to raise you for over an hour. It was Casey himself, manning the emergency communication station with the dedication that had made Rebecca notice him in the first place. Casey, I need you to clear the main runway immediately. I'm coming in fast with multiple system failures and significant battle damage. This is going to be more controlled crash than conventional landing. Copy that, Rebecca. Runway is being cleared now. Emergency crews are standing by in full readiness. We have you on visual approach. You're trailing a substantial amount of smoke. Can you maintain current altitude and heading? Rebecca glanced at her rapidly failing engine indicators and felt her heart sink. Negative, Casey. I'm losing power fast and the flight controls are barely responding. I'm not going to make a normal approach. Tell General Reynolds that the mission was successful, supplies were delivered on target, and Major Anderson's team has what they need to survive. Through her cracked windscreen, she could see Stormwind Air Force Base in the distance, its runway looking impossibly small and far away. The main landing strip appeared to be no more than a thin line of concrete that she had to hit with absolute precision, or risk cartwheeling into the surrounding buildings and personnel. Her damaged wing was creating so much drag and instability that she was approaching far too fast for any semblance of a normal landing. The flight characteristics of Lightning Strike 312 had been fundamentally altered by the battle damage, and every control input produced unexpected and dangerous results. 8 miles out, the engine seized with a grinding screech of tortured metal. Lightning Strike 312 immediately began losing altitude rapidly, its glide ratio compromised by the aerodynamic chaos created by the damaged wing and dead engine. Rebecca realized with crystal clarity that she wasn't going to make the runway. She was going to come up short and crash into the perimeter fence, killing herself and potentially endangering ground personnel. That's when she remembered an advanced technique from her most challenging simulation scenarios, something so dangerous and theoretical that it was considered more of an academic exercise than a practical maneuver. She could use the damaged wing as an improvised air brake, deliberately stalling the aircraft at precisely the right moment to bleed off speed and drop it onto the runway like a controlled falling stone. The technique required absolutely perfect timing and a level of aerodynamic intuition that bordered on supernatural ability. Too early, and she would stall short of the runway, creating a fatal crash. Too late, and she would slam into the ground at lethal speed with no possibility of survival. She would have exactly one chance to execute the maneuver correctly, and the margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. At 4 miles out, Rebecca began her final approach, knowing that everything she had ever learned about flying was about to be tested in the most unforgiving way possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lightning Strike 312 fell through the Nevada sky like a wounded bird, its dead engine silent and its damaged wing creating a catastrophic trail of smoke and debris. Rebecca gripped the manual flight controls with white knuckles, every muscle in her body straining to maintain even basic control over the crippled aircraft. The electronic flight management systems had failed completely, leaving her with nothing but mechanical linkages, raw physics, and her own intuitive understanding of aerodynamics. At 3 miles from Stormwind Air Force Base, she could see emergency vehicles racing along the runway, their flashing lights creating patterns of red and blue against the desert landscape. Ground crews were clearing the area with military precision, understanding that what was about to happen would either be remembered as a miracle or mourned as a tragedy. Lightning Strike 312. "This is General Reynolds in the tower," came a voice through her emergency radio. "Rebecca, I need you to know that what you accomplished today will be remembered forever. 12 American heroes are alive because of your courage and skill. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, you've already succeeded beyond anyone's expectations." Rebecca's voice was steady despite the chaos around her. "Thank you, sir, but I'm not done yet. I didn't come this far to crash short of the runway. Lightning Strike 312 is coming home." At 2 miles out, she began implementing the most dangerous maneuver she had ever attempted. The damaged wing was actually working in her favor now, creating irregular airflow patterns that she could manipulate to control her descent rate. It was like trying to land while riding a controlled avalanche, but her thousands of simulator hours had taught her to think in 3 dimensions and anticipate how aircraft would respond to unconventional inputs. 1 mile out, Rebecca could see Individual people on the ground, their faces turned upward as they watched her desperate approach. She whispered her uncle's prayer one final time, then began the sequence that would either save her life or end it. She pulled the manual controls into a configuration that should have been impossible for the damaged aircraft. Lightning strike. 312 shuddered and groaned. Its airframe stressed far beyond design specifications. The entire aircraft felt like it was about to tear itself apart, but Rebecca held the configuration steady, using the damaged wing's chaotic aerodynamics to create a controlled stall. Half a mile out, she could see the runway numbers painted on the concrete. This was the moment of truth. Too early, and she would drop like a stone into the desert floor. Too late, and she would slam into the runway at fatal speed. The timing had to be absolutely perfect. Quarter mile. Rebecca's world narrowed to a single point of focus. Everything she had ever learned, every hour of preparation, every moment of doubt and determination, all condensed into the next few seconds. She could feel the aircraft's energy state, could sense exactly when the stall would complete, could anticipate the precise moment when Lightning Strike 312 would transform from flying machine to falling object. At exactly 200 feet above the runway, Rebecca executed the stall with surgical precision. The F-35 dropped out of the sky like a controlled meteorite, its forward momentum bleeding away as gravity took control. For a terrifying moment, the aircraft hung suspended between flight and destruction, balanced on the knife's edge between success and catastrophe. The landing was less graceful touchdown than controlled crash. Lightning Strike 312 hit the runway with tremendous force, bounced twice, and began sliding forward in a shower of sparks and debris. Rebecca fought the controls as the aircraft skidded sideways, threatening to flip over and disintegrate. The damaged wing was creating massive asymmetric forces that tried to send the F-35 into a deadly cartwheel. At the last possible moment, she managed to straighten the aircraft's path using differential braking and what remained of her flight controls. Lightning Strike 312 slid to a grinding halt just yards from the end of the runway, smoke pouring from its battle-scarred fuselage and the acrid smell of burned hydraulic fluid filling the air. For several seconds, Rebecca sat motionless in the cockpit, hardly believing she was still alive. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the mission finally catching up with reality. She had done it. Against impossible odds, with a crippled aircraft and no electronic systems, she had brought herself home through sheer skill and determination. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft within seconds, but Rebecca was already climbing out of the cockpit under her own power. She looked back at the destroyed Lightning Strike 312 and felt a mixture of gratitude and sadness. The aircraft had performed magnificently under the worst possible conditions, and together they had accomplished something that would be remembered for decades. As her feet touched the runway concrete, Rebecca realized that she had just pulled off the most spectacular emergency landing in Stormwind's history. But more importantly, she had proven that years of quiet preparation and dedication could overcome any obstacle, no matter how impossible it seemed to others. The mechanic who had been dismissed as unqualified had just demonstrated flying skills that would become legend among military aviators. She had flown into the most dangerous airspace in the world, completed her mission under extreme combat conditions, and brought herself home through innovative techniques that would revolutionize emergency procedures. But as the emergency crews checked her for injuries and the base personnel began gathering around the smoking wreckage, Rebecca Santana felt something she had never experienced before: the absolute certainty that she had finally proven her worth to herself and everyone who had ever doubted her capabilities. The real test, however, would be facing the people who had dismissed her just hours earlier. Captain Morrison, the pilots who had laughed at her qualifications, and all the others who had assumed she would fail spectacularly. In a few minutes, she would discover whether success could truly silence the voices of doubt, or whether some people would never accept that the impossible had just become reality. Rebecca Santana emerged from the smoking wreckage of Lightning Strike 312 with her flight suit stained by hydraulic fluid and a thin line of blood on her left temple, where a piece of shrapnel had grazed her during the chaotic landing. She looked nothing like the triumphant hero of a Hollywood movie. Instead, she looked like someone who had wrestled with death itself and barely emerged victorious. The entire base had turned out to witness her return. Mechanics, ground crews, administrative personnel, security forces, and pilots stood in a wide semicircle around the destroyed aircraft, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of awe, disbelief, and newfound respect. The silence was profound and almost reverent, broken only by the crackling of cooling metal and the distant wail of emergency sirens that were no longer needed. General Reynolds was the first to approach, his weathered face showing an expression Rebecca had never seen before, not just professional respect, but something approaching genuine reverence. He stopped 3 feet away and slowly removed his cap, a gesture of honor typically reserved for fallen heroes or visiting dignitaries of the highest rank. "Staff Sergeant Santana," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed crowd. "I need to know about the mission status. Did you successfully reach the extraction point and deliver the supplies to Major Anderson's team?" Rebecca nodded, exhaustion weighing down her shoulders like a physical burden she could barely carry. "Mission accomplished, sir. All supply packages delivered on target, with visual confirmation of successful receipt. Major Anderson's team had clear line of sight to the drop zone and signaled successful recovery of medical equipment, ammunition, and communications gear. They now have what they need to hold their position until reinforcements arrive." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the assembled crowd like a wave breaking on shore. 12 American Special Operations personnel were alive and equipped for survival because the woman they had dismissed as just a mechanic had accomplished what experienced combat pilots had declared impossible. That's when Captain Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his face pale and his usual arrogance completely absent. His hands trembled slightly as he approached, and his voice carried a weight of emotion that Rebecca had never heard from him before. "Rebecca," he said, using her first name for the first time in 3 years, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond words. What you accomplished today it was beyond impossible. It was miraculous. I was wrong to doubt you, wrong to dismiss your qualifications, and wrong to assume you would fail." Rebecca looked at him steadily, remembering his words from just hours earlier. "Send the mechanic. When she crashes and burns, at least we'll know we tried everything." She had every right to be angry, every justification for throwing his mockery back in his face with interest. Instead, she simply nodded with the grace that had always defined her character. "Apology accepted, Captain. We all have our roles to play in this mission, and doubt is sometimes necessary to ensure we've considered every alternative. What matters is that the mission succeeded and 12 lives were saved." Lieutenant Commander Chun approached next, his cocky demeanor from earlier completely evaporated. "I still don't understand how you did it," he said, shaking his head in bewilderment. "The manual navigation through electromagnetic interference, the precision supply drop under heavy anti-aircraft fire, that emergency landing technique, none of it should have been possible for someone without extensive combat experience." Rebecca pulled her worn tactical notebook from her chest pocket, its pages now stained with hydraulic fluid and marked with burn marks from flying debris. "Preparation," she said simply, holding up the book that contained years of meticulous study. Every simulation hour, every system analysis, every maintenance inspection, every conversation with returning pilots, it all led to this moment. Knowledge doesn't care about your rank or your job title. It only cares about how thoroughly you prepare. Technical Sergeant Walsh pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her weathered face despite her efforts to maintain military composure. My husband's navigation unit, she said, embracing Rebecca with fierce pride. Did it help when your electronics failed? It saved my life, Rebecca replied honestly, returning the embrace with genuine gratitude. When all the sophisticated systems failed, that old mechanical compass was the only thing keeping me oriented. Your husband would be proud to know his equipment is still saving lives 15 years after his death. Senior Airman Patel appeared next, his young face bright with excitement and vindication. The emergency frequencies worked perfectly, didn't they? When I heard your voice on that backup channel, I knew you were going to make it home. Casey, those frequency lists made the difference between a successful landing and a catastrophic crash, Rebecca said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Your father taught you well, and that knowledge became part of the mission's success. Rebecca looked around at the faces surrounding her, the people who had quietly supported her when the officers had dismissed her capabilities. Technical specialists who had shared their knowledge, young airmen who had looked up to her dedication, and veteran NCOs who understood that true expertise often resided in unexpected places. All of you contributed to this mission's success, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. Every person who helped me prepare, who shared knowledge, who believed in preparation over politics, you're all part of what happened today. General Reynolds stepped forward again, his voice taking on the formal tone of military protocol. Staff Sergeant Santana, your actions today reflect the highest traditions of military service. You voluntarily undertook a mission that experienced combat pilots deemed impossible. You successfully delivered critical supplies under extreme combat conditions, and you demonstrated innovative flying techniques that will revolutionize our emergency procedures. He paused, looking around at the assembled crowd. Furthermore, your technical expertise and creative problem-solving under life-threatening conditions demonstrate exceptional skill and courage that deserves formal recognition. I am recommending you for immediate promotion to Technical Sergeant and the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the sudden praise, but something inside her rebelled against the fanfare and ceremony. Sir, with respect, I don't need medals or promotions. I just want to continue doing my job to the best of my ability. Your job has fundamentally changed, General Reynolds replied firmly. Effective immediately, you are being offered transfer to our advanced pilot training program. The military cannot afford to waste talent like yours in a maintenance capacity when you've proven yourself capable of accomplishing missions that seasoned combat pilots consider impossible. The announcement sent a murmur through the crowd, but Rebecca shook her head without hesitation. General, I appreciate the offer more than you can imagine, Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. But my place is with the aircraft themselves. Someone has to keep them flying safely. Someone has to ensure that the pilots who do get assigned to combat missions have equipment they can trust with their lives. Captain Morrison stepped forward again, his voice carrying a new note of humility that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier. Rebecca, you've proven beyond any doubt that you're one of the finest pilots this base has ever seen. You accomplished something that none of us had the courage or skill to attempt. Why would you want to stay in maintenance when you could be leading combat missions? Rebecca looked around at the faces watching her mechanics who had always respected her work, young airmen who looked up to her dedication, veteran NCOs who understood the value of expertise over ego, and pilots who were still processing the reality of what they had just witnessed. She thought about her uncle, who had died testing experimental aircraft so that others could fly safely. She thought about the 12 special operations personnel, who were alive because someone had prepared obsessively for an impossible mission. Because, she said finally, someone has to be ready for the next impossible mission. Someone has to study the places where other people are afraid to go. Someone has to prepare for the day when all the qualified pilots declare something can't be done. She opened her tactical notebook and held it up for everyone to see. The pages were filled with detailed technical drawings, mission analyses, and preparation notes that represented thousands of hours of dedicated study. You called me just a mechanic, Captain Morrison, but you were wrong. I'm not just anything. I'm the person who makes sure aircraft function when they absolutely have to. I'm the person who studies every system until I understand it better than the engineers who designed it. I'm the person who prepares for scenarios that everyone else considers impossible. Rebecca closed the notebook and tucked it back into her pocket with the same reverence she had always shown her tools and equipment. When the next Shadow Valley comes along, and it will come along, I'll be ready. Because that's what we do. In maintenance, we keep things working when everything else falls apart. Technical Sergeant Walsh stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. What Rebecca is saying is that she understands something the rest of us sometimes forget. Flying the mission was never the point. Being ready when no one else can do the job, that's the point. Senior Airman Patel nodded enthusiastically. She's been teaching us that true expertise comes from quiet, consistent preparation. Not from seeking glory or recognition, but from being so thoroughly prepared that when the impossible becomes necessary, you're the only person who can make it possible. General Reynolds studied Rebecca with the calculating gaze of a commander who had spent decades recognizing exceptional talent in unexpected forms. Staff Sergeant Santana, I want to make sure I understand your position correctly. You're declining transfer to pilot training in order to remain in aircraft maintenance? Yes, sir, Rebecca replied without hesitation. With one request. I'd like permission to establish an advanced technical training program for maintenance personnel, something that combines traditional mechanical expertise with pilot-level understanding of aircraft systems and emergency procedures. We need maintenance technicians who can think like pilots when aircraft come back damaged or when systems fail in unexpected ways. The general's eyebrows rose with interest. Go on. Today's mission succeeded because I understood both the mechanical systems and the flight characteristics of the F-35, Rebecca explained. I knew how the aircraft would respond to damage, how to compensate for system failures, and how to extract maximum performance under extreme conditions. That knowledge shouldn't be limited to pilots. The people who maintain these aircraft should understand them just as completely. Captain Morrison, still processing his own transformation from skeptic to supporter, stepped forward. You want to create a program that trains mechanics to think like pilots? I want to create a program that eliminates the artificial distinction between just mechanics and real pilots, Rebecca corrected gently. Both groups are essential to mission success. Both groups need to understand these aircraft at the deepest possible level. And both groups need to be prepared for the day when conventional wisdom says something is impossible. The crowd had grown during their conversation as word of Rebecca's successful mission spread throughout the base. Now it included personnel from every department: communications specialists, security forces, administrative staff, and even civilian contractors who worked on base. All of them had come to see the mechanic who had redefined what was possible. There's something else, Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength as she outlined her vision. This program should include mandatory simulation time for all technical personnel. Not just basic aircraft familiarization, but actual flight training that helps them understand how their maintenance decisions affect pilot safety and mission effectiveness. Diana Walsh smiled through her tears. You want to create an army of technicians who think like you do. I want to create a culture where preparation is valued over politics, where expertise is recognized regardless of rank or job title, and where everyone understands that the next impossible mission might require exactly the skills they've been quietly developing. Rebecca replied. General Reynolds was nodding slowly, his expression showing the kind of strategic thinking that had made him a successful commander. This program you're proposing It would fundamentally change how we approach aircraft maintenance and technical training. Yes, sir. And it would ensure that the next time someone needs to fly into Shadow Valley or attempt an impossible rescue, we have multiple people ready to step up instead of just hoping the AI system identifies someone who happened to prepare on their own time. The general extended his hand to Rebecca with genuine respect. Staff Sergeant Santana, you have authorization to develop this program. I'm also approving your promotion to Technical Sergeant, effective immediately. You've earned it through exceptional service and innovative thinking that will benefit this entire command. As the crowd began to disperse, many personnel made a point of stopping to shake Rebecca's hand or offer words of gratitude and respect. She had become something more than a mechanic in their eyes. She had become a symbol of what was possible when preparation met opportunity, when quiet competence was finally recognized for its true value. But Rebecca's most important moment came when she was finally alone with the smoking wreckage of Lightning Strike 312. She placed her hand on the aircraft's battle-scarred fuselage and whispered a quiet thank you to the machine that had carried her through the impossible and brought her home safely. Tomorrow she would return to her work with a new rank, new responsibilities, and the respect of everyone on base. But today, she had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the military arsenal was a person who refused to give up on their dreams, no matter how many times the world told them they weren't qualified to pursue them. 3 weeks after the Shadow Valley mission, Rebecca Santana arrived at work to find something that stopped her in her tracks. Mounted prominently on the wall of the main maintenance hangar was a large professional photograph of her emerging from the damaged Lightning Strike 312, her face serious and focused, her flight suit bearing the evidence of her extraordinary ordeal. Beneath the image, engraved in polished brass, were words that would inspire generations of airmen. Technical Sergeant Rebecca Santana, the mechanic, who redefined impossible. But the real surprise came when she powered up the computer systems in the advanced training facility that General Reynolds had approved for her program. A new module had been added to the official military flight training curriculum, the Santana Maneuver, Advanced Emergency Landing, Techniques for Catastrophic System Failure. Her improvised air brake landing had been analyzed, documented, and turned into formal military doctrine that would be taught to pilots across all branches of service. Rebecca found herself smiling as she read the technical description of her desperate last-second maneuver. The military had a remarkable ability to make the impossible sound routine when it was written in proper technical language, but she knew the truth, that landing had been equal parts skill, preparation, and sheer determination to prove that. Quiet competence was just as valuable as loud confidence. Over the following months, Rebecca's life settled into a new rhythm that was both familiar and revolutionary. She remained in the maintenance bay by choice, but her role had fundamentally transformed. Young mechanics sought her guidance, not just on technical procedures, but on the philosophy of preparation that had made her legendary. Experienced pilots regularly asked for her input on aircraft modifications and emergency procedures, recognizing that her unique perspective bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Most importantly, a steady stream of personnel began requesting assignment to her newly established Advanced Technical Training Program. Word had spread throughout the military about the mechanic who had accomplished the impossible, and young airmen wanted to learn from someone who embodied excellence without ego, competence without arrogance. Senior Airman Patel, now promoted to Staff Sergeant, had become Rebecca's unofficial assistant and the first graduate of her comprehensive training program. His attention to detail and willingness to learn reminded Rebecca of herself at that age, and she took special pride in watching him develop the same methodical approach that had served her so well. Why do you think the simulation training is so important? Patel asked one afternoon as they worked together on routine maintenance of a newly delivered F-35. I mean, we're mechanics, not pilots. Rebecca paused in her inspection of the aircraft's flight control system, considering how to explain something that had become fundamental to her worldview. Because understanding how these aircraft behave in flight makes us better at maintaining them on the ground, she said finally. When you know how the pilot will react to a system malfunction, you can anticipate which components will be stressed and need closer inspection. When you understand flight dynamics, you can predict how battle damage will affect aircraft performance. She gestured toward the sleek fighter they were servicing. Every maintenance decision we make affects someone's ability to come home alive. The more completely we understand these machines, the better we can serve the people who depend on them. The training program had evolved beyond Rebecca's original vision. It now included not just simulation flight training for maintenance personnel, but cross-training that gave pilots hands-on experience with the mechanical systems they relied on. The artificial barrier between mechanics and pilots was gradually dissolving, replaced by a culture of mutual respect and shared expertise. 6 months after Shadow Valley, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor that would become one of her most treasured memories. Major Jennifer Storm Anderson appeared in the maintenance hangar, wearing dress blues and carrying a small wooden box that bore the weight of genuine gratitude. "Technical Sergeant Santana," Anderson said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. My entire team, 12 people with families, children, dreams, were all here because of your courage and skill." She handed Rebecca the wooden box with the reverence reserved for the most precious gifts. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a compass that bore the scratches and wear of extensive use. "This belonged to my grandfather. He carried it through 3 wars and always said it would find its way to someone who needed it more than he did. After what you did for us in Shadow Valley, I know he'd want you to have it." Rebecca accepted the compass with a solemnity such a gift deserved. "Major, I was just doing my job to the best of my ability." "No," Anderson replied firmly. "You did something that no one else was willing or able to do. You flew into hell and brought hope out with you. That compass belongs with someone who knows how to find their way home against impossible odds." That evening, alone in the simulation room where her journey had begun, Rebecca opened her tactical notebook and made what would be her final entry. "No one is born chosen, but anyone can become irreplaceable through preparation, dedication, and the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others." She looked around at the room where she had spent thousands of hours preparing for a mission everyone said was impossible. The old simulators hummed quietly, ready for the next person who would dare to dream of accomplishing things others feared to attempt. Rebecca Santana had never wanted to be a hero or a legend. She had only wanted to do meaningful work, honor her uncle's memory, and be ready when someone needed her unique combination of skills and determination. But in pursuing those simple goals with unwavering dedication, she had become something more valuable than a hero. She had become irreplaceable. As she powered down the simulation system and prepared to leave for the night, Rebecca caught sight of her reflection in the dark monitor screen. She no longer saw the mechanic who had been dismissed and mocked, but the woman who had proven that true strength often resided in quiet preparation, that the most important battles were sometimes fought by the most unlikely warriors, and that preparation combined with opportunity could overcome any obstacle. Outside, the F-35 Lightning E's sat in their climate-controlled hangars, maintained and ready by hands that understood their every component and quirk. Tomorrow, Rebecca would return to her work with the knowledge that when the next impossible mission arose, there would be multiple people ready to answer the call, because that's what her program was creating. 1 year after the Shadow Valley mission, the transformation at Stormwind Air Force Base was nothing short of revolutionary. What had begun as one mechanic's obsessive preparation had evolved into a fundamental shift in how the military approached the relationship between technical expertise and operational capability. Rebecca's advanced technical training program had not only been approved for base-wide implementation, but had been selected as a pilot program for the entire Air Force. The morning briefing room that had once witnessed Rebecca's humiliation was now home to something unprecedented. Joint sessions where pilots and maintenance personnel planned missions together, sharing expertise and insights that had previously been compartmentalized by rigid military hierarchy. Captain Morrison, transformed by his experience with Rebecca's mission, had become one of the program's most vocal advocates. 6 months ago, I would have said that mechanics should stick to wrenches and pilots should stick to flying, Morrison admitted during a training session. Rebecca Santana proved that artificial divisions between technical specialties were limiting our operational effectiveness. Now I wouldn't dream of planning a complex mission without input from the people who understand these aircraft at the component level. The program's success had attracted attention from the highest levels of military command. General Patricia Vance, the Air Force Chief of Operations, had visited Stormwind specifically to observe Rebecca's training methodology and consider expanding it across all major installations. What she found exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Technical Sergeant Santana has created something genuinely innovative, General Vance reported after spending 3 days observing the program. By combining technical expertise with operational understanding, she's developed personnel who can think critically about problems from multiple perspectives. These aren't just mechanics who can fly or pilots who can turn wrenches, they're aviation professionals who understand the complete picture. Rebecca's influence extended far beyond formal training programs. Throughout the base, a new culture was emerging, one that valued preparation over politics, expertise over ego, and collaborative problem-solving over hierarchical decision-making. Young airmen who had joined the service expecting to be limited by their job classifications were discovering that Rebecca's philosophy opened doors they had never imagined possible. Staff Sergeant Casey Patel had become the program's first success story. His combination of technical knowledge and flight training had made him invaluable during a recent emergency, when an F-35 returned from a training mission with multiple system failures. While the pilot focused on flying the damaged aircraft, Patel had talked him through complex troubleshooting procedures from the ground, ultimately saving both the aircraft and the pilot's life. Everything I know about thinking 3 steps ahead, I learned from watching Rebecca, Patel explained to a group of new trainees. She taught me that being prepared isn't just about knowing your own job, it's about understanding how your job connects to everyone else's mission. The simulation room where Rebecca had spent countless solitary hours had been expanded into a comprehensive training facility that operated 18 hours a day. Advanced scenarios based on real-world missions challenged personnel to apply their cross-training in situations that demanded both technical expertise and operational judgment. The most popular scenario, naturally, was a recreation of the Shadow Valley mission that had started everything. Every trainee wants to attempt the Santana scenario, laughed Technical Sergeant Deanna Walsh, now serving as the program's senior instructor. It's become our ultimate test of whether someone truly understands what it means to be prepared for the impossible. But Rebecca's greatest pride came from seeing how her philosophy had influenced personnel who would never fly combat missions or work on aircraft. Administrative specialists were applying her methodical preparation approach to logistics planning. Communications personnel were cross-training with technical specialties to better understand the equipment they supported. Even security forces had adopted simulation training to prepare for scenarios they hoped never to encounter. The transformation wasn't limited to Stormwind. Military installations around the world were requesting information about the Santana model of integrated training. Defense contractors were redesigning their technical documentation to include operational context that helped maintenance personnel understand the mission impact of their work. Aviation schools were revising their curricula to eliminate the artificial separation between technical and operational training. Rebecca's story had become legendary. not just within military circles, but throughout the aviation community. The International Society of Flight Test Engineers had invited her to speak at their annual conference, making her the first enlisted maintenance technician ever accorded such honor. Her presentation, titled "When Preparation Meets Opportunity: A Mechanic's Perspective on Impossible Missions," had received a standing ovation from an audience of the world's most accomplished aviation professionals. "I've spent 30 years in experimental flight testing," said Dr. Margaret Chun, the Society's president, "and I've never heard a more compelling argument for the value of comprehensive preparation. Technical Sergeant Santana's approach should be required study for anyone involved in aviation safety." The media attention had been intense but carefully managed. Rebecca had declined most interview requests, preferring to let her work speak for itself. However, she had agreed to participate in a documentary about military innovation that would help spread awareness of her training philosophy to other services and allied nations. "The story isn't about me," she told the documentary crew. "It's about what becomes possible when we stop limiting people based on job titles and start developing their full potential." Shadow Valley was just one mission. The real victory is creating a culture where the next impossible mission won't depend on one person happening to be prepared. It will depend on many people being ready to step up. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The families of the 12 Special Operations personnel she had saved had collectively commissioned a memorial bench to be placed outside the main hangar. The inscription read, "In honor of Technical Sergeant Rebecca Santana and all who prepare in silence for moments that demand everything." Rebecca had discovered the bench early one morning during her routine pre-shift walk. As she sat in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the first aircraft of the day being prepared for flight, she realized that her uncle's legacy lived on not just in her own achievements, but in the culture of excellence she had helped create. The mechanic who had been dismissed as unqualified had become the architect of a revolution in military thinking, one that recognized that true capability came not from rank or job title, but from the relentless pursuit of excellence in preparation for moments when everything depended on being ready. 5 years after the Shadow Valley mission, Rebecca Santana walked through the corridors of Stormwind Air Force Base with the quiet confidence of someone who had fundamentally changed the world around her while remaining true to her core values. Now Master Sergeant Santana, she carried herself with the same unassuming dignity that had always defined her character, but the respect she commanded was evident in every interaction. The base itself had been transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a traditional military installation organized around rigid, hierarchical structures had evolved into something unprecedented, a truly integrated aviation community, where expertise was valued regardless of rank or specialty. The Stormwind model had become the template for military installations worldwide, and Rebecca's advanced technical training program was now mandatory curriculum at every major aviation facility. As she made her morning rounds through the expanded maintenance complex, Rebecca reflected on how far they had all come. The young airmen who worked alongside her were products of her integrated training philosophy, equally comfortable with wrenches and flight controls, equally prepared to support missions or execute them when circumstances demanded. They represented a new generation of military professionals who didn't see artificial barriers between technical and operational roles. "Good morning, Master Sergeant," called Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, one of Rebecca's most accomplished protégés. Santos had recently returned from a deployment where she had flown 3 combat missions as a reserve pilot, while maintaining her primary role as avionics specialist. The new F-35 variants arrived overnight. "Want to take a look at the upgraded systems?" Rebecca smiled, remembering when such cross-functional capability would have been unthinkable. "Lead the way, Maria. I'm curious to see how the manufacturers have incorporated our maintenance recommendations into the design." The aircraft industry had been forced to adapt to the cultural changes Rebecca had initiated. Defense contractors now designed systems with input from maintenance personnel who understood operational requirements. Technical manuals included operational context that helped mechanics understand the mission impact of their work. Most importantly, the artificial separation between operators and maintainers had been largely eliminated in favor of integrated teams that shared responsibility for mission success. As they examined the new aircraft, Rebecca noticed a familiar face among the inspection team. Captain Tyler Morrison, now Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, had become one of the military's leading advocates for integrated training. His transformation from skeptic to supporter had been so complete that he now taught courses on leadership humility and the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of its source. "Rebecca," Morrison called out, using her first name with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned to value competence over protocol. "I wanted you to see something." He handed her a tablet displaying mission statistics that made her pause in amazement. "These numbers can't be right," she said, studying the data. "Mission success rates are up 47% across all aviation units that have implemented your training model. Aircraft availability rates have improved by 32%. Most remarkably, emergency situation outcomes have improved by 61%. Morrison nodded with satisfaction. The correlation is undeniable. When personnel understand both the technical and operational aspects of their equipment, they make better decisions under pressure. Your philosophy has literally saved hundreds of lives and millions of dollars in equipment." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of General Marcus Reynolds, now retired but serving as a senior consultant to the Defense Department's innovation initiatives. His presence at Stormwind had become a weekly tradition as he continued to study the long-term effects of the cultural transformation Rebecca had catalyzed. "Master Sergeant Santana," he said with the warm respect that had developed between them over the years, "I have news that I think will interest you. The President has approved the establishment of the Santana Institute for Integrated Military Excellence. It will be the military's first research facility dedicated to developing training methodologies that break down traditional specialty barriers." Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being proposed. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to lead such an institution." "You're not just the right person," Reynolds replied firmly. "You're the only person. This institute will need someone who embodies the principles it represents, someone who values preparation over politics, competence over credentials, and collaborative excellence over individual recognition." As they walked toward the memorial bench that had become Rebecca's favorite place for reflection, she considered how drastically her life had changed since that morning when she had volunteered for an impossible mission. The mechanic who had been dismissed as unqualified now influenced military policy at the highest levels. Her training philosophy was being studied at war colleges around the world. Most importantly, thousands of young military professionals were developing their careers without the artificial limitations that had once seemed insurmountable. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Rebecca said as they sat on the bench overlooking the flight line. "It's not the mission or the recognition or even the policy changes. It's the fact that when the next impossible situation arises, there won't be just one person ready to handle it. There will be hundreds." The flight line before them bustled with activity as aircraft prepared for training missions that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. Maintenance personnel who could fly, pilots who understood complex mechanical systems, communications specialists who could troubleshoot avionics. All of them trained to think beyond their job descriptions and prepared to step up when circumstances demanded more than anyone had the right to expect. "Rebecca," Morrison said quietly, "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. That day in the command center when I dismissed you as just a mechanic, I wasn't just wrong about your capabilities. I was wrong about what it means to serve. You taught me that true military excellence comes from people who prepare in silence for moments that test everything they've learned. Rebecca stood and placed her hand on the memorial bench's inscription, thinking about her uncle and all the others who had prepared quietly for missions that would demand everything they had to give. The military has always been filled with heroes, she said. The difference now is that we're creating systems that help more people discover their own heroic potential. As the sun rose over Stormwind Air Force Base, illuminating a facility that had become a model for military installations worldwide, Rebecca Santana felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing her legacy would extend far beyond any single mission or moment of recognition. She had proven that the most powerful force in any organization was not authority or technology, but the quiet determination of people who refused to accept limitations others placed on their potential. The brass nameplate on her workstation still read, Santana, Aircraft Maintenance, but everyone at Stormwind knew the truth. She wasn't just a mechanic who had learned to fly. She was the guardian angel who had taught an entire military culture that when heroes needed wings, those wings would never fail them because someone, somewhere had prepared for the moment when preparation met impossible opportunity. And in maintenance bays and flight simulators around the world, a new generation of military professionals was learning that sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal was a person who refused to give up on their dreams, no matter how many times the world told them they weren't qualified to pursue them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.